Welcome back, listeners. Today, we're taking a deep dive into, well, a classic Oliver twist.
You got it, but with a bit of a twist.
I see what you did there.
We've got this fantastic book review as our source material.
And it really digs deep, beyond the surface level stuff everyone already knows.
Definitely. It's going to be fascinating, I think, to see how much more there is to discover.
I'm excited to get into it. So, what's the mission today? What are we hoping to uncover?
Well, Oliver Twist, it can be read on a bunch of different levels.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got the surface, the basic plot, but if you really look closely, there are all these fascinating insights about Victorian society, about Dickens' style, even some controversies surrounding some of the characters.
Ooh, controversies are always fun. I'm already hooked.
Yeah, they definitely make things interesting. So, like, for instance, everyone remembers that iconic line, right? Please, sir, I want some more.
Of course. Poor Oliver. It's such a heartbreaking moment.
Right, but it's more than just that, isn't it? I mean, think about it. That one line tells us so much about the Victorian poor law system.
Oh, yeah. It really reveals the harsh reality of those workhouses.
Exactly. Dickens doesn't shy away from showing the cruelty, the indifference in places that were supposed to be helping the poor.
And that's what I love about Dickens. He's not afraid to tackle those tough issues head on.
Right. He blends Gothic elements with this gritty realism, all wrapped up in social commentary that's honestly as relevant today as it was back then.
Absolutely. Speaking of realism, the review talked a lot about how London itself becomes a character in the story.
Oh, it's so true. It's not just a backdrop. Dickens brings London to life.
You can practically smell the coal smoke, feel the cobblestones under your feet.
Yes, those shadowy streets, the gin mills like the Three Cripples, even Fagin's Den.
Oh, so creepy. It's like Dickens is giving us a guided tour of the underbelly of Victorian London.
Yeah, a fascinating but slightly unsettling tour.
For sure. And for those listeners who know a bit about literary movements,
Yeah.
Dickens was really one of the pioneers of urban realism in English literature.
Definitely. One of the first to portray the lives of the poor and marginalized with such honesty and detail.
Makes you wonder, how Dickens, who experienced poverty firsthand, actually saw the city in his time.
That's a fantastic point. His personal experiences absolutely informed his writing.
It wasn't just fiction, it was a reflection of the world he knew.
Exactly. And then, you've got Oliver navigating this vivid and often dangerous London, but he also meets these incredible characters.
Like Fagin.
Ah, yes,
Ugh.
Fagin. He's the one that readers seem to either love to hate or hate to love.
Right, so complex.
He's sparked a lot of discussion over the years.
The review definitely didn't shy away from those discussions either.
No, they didn't. What was interesting, though, was how the reviewer approached Fagin. They didn't just label him a villain. They dug deeper, examined the complexities of his character.
It really brought out that blend of aversion and humanity that Dickens portrays.
That's so typical of Dickens, though. He rarely presents characters as simply good or evil.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They're nuanced, they're flawed, just like real people.
Human nature in all its messy glory.
Exactly. And Fagin's a perfect example of that.
It reminds me a bit of how Shakespeare created those morally ambiguous characters. We're still debating them centuries later.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison. Dickens, like Shakespeare, understood the human nature isn't black and white.
There's so many shades of gray in between.
Exactly. And he captures those nuances so well in his characters.
Uh-huh.
Now, another thing that stood out in the book review was how much emphasis they put on Dickens's use of satire.
Yeah, I loved that part, especially when it comes to the wealthy and those in authority.
Dickens doesn't hold back.
No, he doesn't. He really highlights their hypocrisy, but he does it so cleverly.
Right. He doesn't just tell us they're flawed. He shows us through their actions, their words.
Exactly. It's not just, hey, look how bad these people are.
It's showing the reader those inequalities in a way that's both entertaining and thought-provoking. And the reviewer really praised him for that.
Yeah, they argued that the satire elevates Oliver Twist from just an adventure story to a critique of the entire societal system.
Right. And it makes us confront those uncomfortable truths about that period, maybe even question our own assumptions about the world today.
So even though it's a 19th century novel, it still speaks to us on a fundamental level about poverty, injustice, the struggle for a better life.
Exactly. It's timeless in many ways. And as we go deeper into Oliver Twist, it's important to remember that Dickens was, above all, a master storyteller.
Oh, he knew how to keep his audience hooked.
He used melodrama, coincidence, all those techniques that might seem a bit over the top to us now, but they were hallmarks of Victorian literature.
It's like stepping into a different world with its own set of rules.
And the reviewer argued that understanding those conventions can really enhance our appreciation of the novel.
Like learning a new language.
Precisely. Once you grasp the nuances, you can truly appreciate the beauty and complexity of what's being expressed.
All right, so before we move on to part 2, what are some key takeaways you think listeners should keep in mind as we continue exploring Oliver Twist?
Well, I'd say first, remember this novel operates on multiple levels. There's the surface plot, but also that deeper social commentary.
Okay, got it.
And Dickens uses all these tools, imagery, satire, even melodrama, to get his message across.
Don't forget those incredible details about London.
You're right. He brings the city to life in such a way that it almost becomes another character in the story.
Perfect. I'm ready to keep digging deeper.
Let's do it. Picking up right where we left off, you mentioned London becoming another character. It's something this book review talks about as well. They actually highlight a specific passage describing the Three Cripples gin mill, the shadowy streets, as a prime example.
Yeah, you can practically feel the grime, and hear the murmur of conversations from those figures hiding in dark corners.
Exactly. It's that immersive quality that really makes Dickens' London so captivating.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's more than just creating atmosphere.
Oh, for sure.
This is where his use of urban realism really comes into play.
Now, for those who might not be as familiar with that term, could you break down what urban realism is?
Yeah.
And how Dickens uses it so effectively?
Sure. Urban realism, it's a literary movement that focuses on depicting the realities of city life, especially for the working class, those who are often marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of, romanticizing the city, authors like Dickens presented a more gritty, a more honest portrayal, often highlighting the social issues and inequalities.
So it's not just about pretty descriptions. It's about using those descriptions to expose the underbelly of society.
Exactly. And Dickens, he was a master at this. Think about how he contrasts the opulence of the wealthy with the squalor of the slums.
Right.
That contrast is deliberate. He's highlighting those vast social disparities in Victorian London.
And it's not just the setting, right? It's also reflected in the characters themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Characters like Nancy, the prostitute with a heart of gold, and the artful dodger, the streetwise pickpocket. They're not idealized figures. They're complex, shaped by their environment.
Which makes me wonder if Dickens saw them as tragic figures, victims of circumstance, or did he see them as people who, even with their flaws, had their own agency, their own strength?
That's such a great question, and it's something Dickens grapples with throughout the novel.
Yeah.
On the one hand, he clearly has sympathy for the poor, and he critiques those systems that keep them in poverty, but he also explores the idea of personal responsibility, the choices we make, even when facing difficult circumstances.
So it's not a simple answer, is it? Just like life itself.
Exactly. That's part of what makes Oliver Twist so fascinating.
Yeah.
It raises all these complex questions about morality, about social justice, about what it means to be human. And those questions stay with you long after you finish the book. Definitely. It's not just entertainment. It's an invitation to engage with the world around us, to really think about these things.
I love that. Now, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the idea that Dickens's own experiences with poverty shaped his writing.
Yeah, it's a point of much debate among literary scholars. Dickens himself sometimes downplayed his hardships, but there's no denying that his time working in that blacking factory as a kid left a mark.
It's almost as if he was living a real-life version of Oliver Twist's story.
And it likely fueled his passion for social reform. He used his writing as a platform, to expose those injustices and advocate for change.
That's what I find so inspiring about Dickens. He didn't just write about these problems, he actively tried to make a difference.
Exactly. He truly understood the power of storytelling. It can entertain, but it can also educate, inspire, even spark real change.
Now, speaking of change, I want to bring up Fagin again.
Okay.
We discussed the controversy, but the reviewer also made a really interesting point about how Fagin represents a larger societal issue.
Oh, yeah. They argue that Fagin embodies this fear of the criminal other that was prevalent in Victorian times.
Right.
This fear, it was often directed at marginalized groups, immigrants, the poor, anyone seen as a threat to the established order.
So Fagin's not just a villain in the story.
No, he becomes this symbol of those deep-seated societal anxieties and prejudices.
And by understanding the historical context, we can see how Dickens is actually critiquing those social forces that contribute to crime and poverty.
Absolutely. He's challenging us to look beyond individual blame and consider the systemic issues.
And sadly, that message still resonates today.
It does. Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious about your take on how Oliver Twist has influenced later works of literature.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Oliver Twist is considered a foundational text in the development of social realism,
Oh, absolutely.
and its influence can be seen in countless novels, plays, films that came after.
Definitely. Many authors who came after Dickens, people like George Orwell or Charles Dickens, they continued to explore those themes of poverty and social injustice.
Yeah.
And even in more modern works, you can see echoes of Oliver Twist in stories that deal with, childhood innocence, loss of innocence, and that resilience of the human spirit.
So even though it was written over 180 years ago, Oliver Twist still speaks to us today.
Yes, its themes are timeless, and the characters have become these archetypes that we see reimagined in contemporary culture.
I'm really excited to dig into that influence in the final part of our deep dive.
Me too. There's so much to explore, especially when it comes to how Oliver Twist has been adapted for stage and screen.
Sounds fascinating. All right, so we've talked a lot about the story, the context, the themes.
Yeah, lots to unpack there.
But for this final part, I
Yeah.
want to focus on Dickens himself, on his craft as a writer.
Absolutely, I think that's key.
It's easy to get caught up in the plot and the social commentary,
Right.
but Dickens was a master of language.
Oh, for sure. His writing deserves just as much attention.
And that's something this book review really emphasized, how Dickens uses language to craft these incredibly vivid, memorable moments.
Yes, they were particularly fascinated by his use of names,
Oh, right.
pointing out how they often hint at a character's personality or their fate.
Like, Oliver itself, coming from the Latin word for olive tree,
Exactly.
it symbolized peace, resilience, even in the midst of hardship.
It's amazing, right? Those subtle layers of meaning.
Definitely adds depth.
It makes Dickens so rewarding to read.
Yeah.
And it's not just the names. Think about his descriptions of London. He doesn't just say it's a busy city.
Right.
He immerses us in the sights, the sounds, even the smells.
Oh, yeah. It's like you're walking right alongside Oliver through those crowded streets.
Exactly. The review actually highlighted that immersive quality in his description of the Three Cripples gin mill.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
They described it as seedy, shadowy, which I think perfectly captures that sense of unease.
You can practically feel the danger lurking around every corner.
It's incredible how he makes a place like that feel like a character itself.
It definitely contributes to the overall mood of the story.
Absolutely. And it circles back to that idea of urban realism we talked about before.
Mm.
Dickens was so good at using those vivid descriptions to expose that darker side of Victorian society.
Now, I know we've already covered a lot of ground on Dickens' social commentary,
Yeah.
but I'm curious about how he actually brings those messages into the story.
Okay.
Is it always very direct, or does he use subtler techniques as well?
It's a great mix, actually. Sometimes he's very straightforward, using a character or the narrator to clearly critique something wrong in society. Other times he's much more subtle, using symbolism, irony, even humor to get his point across.
Does the review give any examples of how he does that?
Yeah, actually they talked about how Dickens contrasts Oliver's innocence with the corruption of the adult world.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's not just about moving the plot forward, it's highlighting that societal issue, how vulnerable children were often mistreated.
Powerful stuff.
Right. He's making us think for ourselves instead of just telling us what to think.
And that's the mark of a truly skilled writer.
Exactly. He trusts his readers to be intelligent, to engage with the material.
Speaking of engaging readers, I think it's safe to say Oliver Twist has had a huge impact on literature, even popular culture in general.
Oh, absolutely. Countless adaptations for stage and screen, and his characters are still so recognizable today.
It's wild to think a story written in the 1830s can still resonate with us in the 21st century.
It speaks to the universality of Dickens' themes.
Yeah.
Poverty, injustice, the fight for survival. These are things that people experience across time and place.
And it's not just the big themes, right? Characters like Fagin, the Artful Dodger, they've practically become icons.
They have. They've been reinterpreted in so many ways. Plays, movies, even cartoons.
It's like Dickens created this entire world that's so rich and complex, it keeps inspiring artists and storytellers.
And you're right, it goes beyond adaptations. Dickens's influence can be seen in so many writers who came after him.
He was a true trailblazer, really set the stage for social realism in literature.
Exactly. Paved the way for authors like George Orwell, Upton Sinclair, to explore similar themes.
And even beyond literature, right? Dickens's work has inspired social reformers, activists, even politicians.
Oh, absolutely. His writing raised awareness of poverty and injustice, motivated people to fight for change.
It's incredible to see the ripple effect of one novel.
It really is. Oliver Twist is a testament to the power of stories, and it reminds us how important compassion and empathy are.
And that fight for a better world.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Oliver Twist, I hope listeners will walk away with a deeper appreciation for Dickens, both as a storyteller and as someone who fought for social justice.
I hope they're inspired to maybe reread Oliver Twist, see it with new eyes.
Yes, paying attention not just to the plot, but to the language, the characters, how Dickens builds this world.
And most importantly, I hope we've sparked their curiosity about Dickens and his other works.
There's so much to discover. Oliver Twist is really just the beginning.
Well said. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Oliver Twist. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of a classic work